Welcome to Chicago's Navy Pier, which was, there's a lot of history about this place, which Steve Edwards can probably share with you in detail, but it was part of Daniel Burnham's famous, some parts of it infamous, plan for Chicago. There were actually supposed to be 5 piers, I believe, built, but like a lot of municipal efforts, it stalled at 1. So here we are. It's housed everything from the University of Illinois campus at one point to a jail for draft dodgers, actually. But happily for our purposes today, it houses Chicago Public Media and WBEZ, our host for today's part of the conference. And it's something of a homecoming for Steve, who used to run BEZ here before he went off to the IOP. So welcome home to you, Steve. A couple of housekeeping things. Today is on the record. And there's a hashtag, of course, Campaign 2016. Is that right, Steph? Yes. I'm sorry, Covering 2016. Is it written somewhere? There it is. It's right behind me. So feel free and actually encouraged to tweet about it. I actually heard from a bunch of disappointed people who said, well, I want to know more about what's going on. So let people know what's going on with this. So yesterday we heard a lot about money, but in oddly different ways. We heard, on the one hand, there's too much attention paid to money and not enough to sort of the power of the parties. Though we did end the day with David Axelrod saying we're not giving enough attention to money. In this Gilded Age, he said, you're only one oligarch away from success. So we are going to start the day actually talking a lot about money. I don't think too much about money. I think it may be hard to talk too much about money going into a presidential campaign. And I just want to say that a lot of today's programming is really the result of Stephanie Friedhoff's amazing efforts. So please, if you get a moment, thank her before you leave today. She's done yeoman's work with Steve and his crew at IOP in putting today's session together. So we are going to turn it over to Niala Boodhoo, who hosts a very popular afternoon show here at the WBEZ studios, and she's been nice enough to agree to lead us through the morning's sessions on money. So with that, Niala.
I think I've got, yeah.
Good morning, guys. Thanks for being here. You know, as we talk about money and we think about this, it was sort of, I was able to pop into a couple sessions yesterday, and there was something that Debbie Wasserman Schultz said, and I checked with her after Congresswoman Schultz, and she said I could say this because I know yesterday was off the record. But she said super PACs don't elect candidates, parties do. And I think we could spend 3 more days arguing about that, but today we are going to at least delve into a little bit of the money. And just to give you guys, I thought since so much of this has been about national, I would throw a few numbers out about our most recent local campaign here in Chicago. As some of you may recall, we just had a pretty interesting election cycle for our mayoral race. And Rahm Emanuel, of course, being the great fundraiser that he is, had a war chest that was almost $44 million for our election cycle for this mayoral campaign. Almost $30 million of that he raised just in this past cycle. And of course, there was a super PAC here. It was called Chicago Forward. And according to our WBEZ data, that raised $5.1 million. So what we're going to do today is look at record spending nationally. This first panel is going to look at that spending, how it affected the election process, different issues that are being discussed, and what campaign ads voters are seeing. So basically everything, hopefully, you all covering the campaign need to know about money and politics. And then the second session will get you started on how you can follow the money trail. So the way we're going to work for this first panel is that some of our panelists have presentations. So I'm going to invite them up individually. They're going to do their presentations, and then we're all going to come up, and hopefully I'm just going to really leave lots of time for questions because I know that's really what you guys have. But let's start with Eliza Newlin Carney. She's a senior writer covering politics, campaign financing, and lobbying for CQ Roll Call. She previously was a contributing editor at the National Journal and an election law columnist for nationaljournal.com.
Hi, thank you for being here, and thanks to Nieman and IOP for hosting this event. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how we got here, what to look for in the current election, and where we're going. It's not an exaggeration to say that we are currently in a state of campaign deregulation that is comparable to the Watergate era. We have a lot of undisclosed, unregulated money. That was the hallmark of the Watergate scandal, a secret slush fund funded by people who brought in suitcases stuffed with cash for the president to punish his political enemies. So that led to the Federal Election Campaign Act, which had 4 pillars: contributions, limits on contributions to candidates and parties, no corporate or labor money, full disclosure, the establishment of the Federal Election Commission, presidential public financing system, all of which are now either in the process of falling down or have already fallen down. What's important about that law was that it was challenged and upheld by the Supreme Court in the landmark Buckley v. Vallejo case. 2 important principles that were established in that case were that it is constitutional to limit campaign spending to prevent corruption or the appearance of corruption. But it also said you cannot limit the amount that an individual may spend on campaigns for themselves or their own elections. So you have millionaire candidates. The original Federal Election Campaign Act tried to limit what candidates and campaigns could spend, and the Buckley ruling said you can't do that because campaign spending is a form of constitutionally protected speech. So we're in a predictable cycle which repeats itself over and over again. You have regulation, politicians and candidates and campaigns being what they are, will test the limits, push them as far as they can, leading to deregulation, followed by scandal. Voters get upset, we have regulation again. So we're sort of in the midst of that now. After the Watergate scandal, the process of deregulation that took place was around soft money. This was unrestricted money that it was contributed to the political parties. Candidates and politicians raised it themselves. The system was widely criticized by all of the players, the politicians and the donors. And it led to sufficient upset over foreign money, the Lincoln bedroom being used to reward donors, that Congress ushered in what was called the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, also known as McCain-Feingold Law after its lead authors. And that law banned soft money. It was upheld in a Supreme Court challenge called McConnell v. FEC, which is important partly because it produced a really exhaustive record from the politicians, from the donors, saying this system stinks. It's entertaining reading if you ever want to go back to it. Fast forward to Citizens United v. FEC, which in 2010, under a new Supreme Court, a more conservative Supreme Court, said that it's actually unconstitutional to limit any kind of independent political spending. And the rationale was that because this is independent, it's non-corrupting, and also it's fully disclosed, so it's non-corrupting. So that theory has been tested in the real world of politics, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. A couple of the important outcomes of Citizens United, as you all know, were with a lower court ruling called Speech Now, ushered in super PACs, which can raise unrestricted money, although they must disclose it to the FEC. It also empowered nonprofit organizations, because Citizens United said corporate spending is okay. Now, there are corporations that are for-profit, like Exxon, but there are also nonprofit corporations. And interestingly enough, the main outcome of Citizens United in some ways has been to empower these nonprofit groups. So again, theory versus practice. Is this money independent? Well, we have a stalemated FEC, which is arguably the ineffectual agency that Congress always intended it to be. So laws that purportedly bar coordination between these outside groups and the candidates are not enforced. Is it fully disclosed? Not really, because you have all these tax-exempt groups that operate outside the disclosure rules. They run all these ads that are purportedly to educate voters, but they're indistinguishable from campaign ads. So that's why we have a system which is in an inexorable march toward deregulation. And recently we saw a challenge to the aggregate political party limit, that's the overall limit on the amount that an individual may donate to a party, by a businessman named Sean McCutcheon. And that challenge was important because under this new conservative Supreme Court, the court essentially furnished a new definition of corruption. Said corruption is not, you can't regulate campaign spending for the purposes of corruption or its appearance, which is what the Buckley ruling had said. basically said you can only regulate corruption in the event that it's quid pro quo corruption. That's a little harder to prove. Quid pro quo corruption takes the form of, I give you a huge check and you promise me a vote. And there has to be some record of that. You have to have promised something verbally or on paper. So that's a pretty high bar to justify limits on campaign activity. And what it does is set the stage for challenges in the future to the other pillars of the Federal Election Campaign Act, the limits on contributions to candidates and the limits on contributions to parties. So we had the soft money era, which led to deregulation. We now have a return to soft money in the form of the McCutcheon ruling, which is allowing candidates and politicians to raise a lot more through these so-called joint fundraising committees. We had a measure slipped into the Cromnibus spending bill by the Senate leaders last year that said parties can now raise 10 times the normal limit for conventions, party building, and recounts. So that's already being raised by politicians for the parties. Another return of soft money. Dark money you hear a lot about. Like the FEC, the IRS is sort of hamstrung. They bungled the whole investigation of Tea Party groups, and they are under investigation in Congress and by the federal government, so they're not really in a position to do anything to regulate this either. The candidates themselves are the ones bringing in this unregulated money. That's why I call it a return to soft money. And what do you want to look for in this election? You do want to look for super PAC fundraising. With all respect to Debbie Wasserman Schultz, it's really a pipe dream to say that the parties are the ones electing the candidates. The super PACs have become an extension of the parties. That's wishful thinking. I mean, maybe she really believes that, but it's just not the case. The parties are doing a lot of activities the super PACs are doing a lot of activities that the parties once did. They're doing voter registration, they're doing polling, they're doing research. The tax-exempt groups are definitely something to watch. You've heard a lot about the Clinton Foundation, but virtually every candidate out there, every Republican candidate out there has an affiliation with a tax-exempt group. I'm hearing the sign for wrap-up, so I'm going to wrap this up very quickly. The important thing about the tax-exempt groups is the non-disclosure is an invitation to a lot of things, including foreign money. So that may be where we see the next scandal. So keep an eye out for joint fundraising committees, massive party fundraising under the new rules. A new thing, limited liability corporations. People use these corporations to sort of hide, like shadow corporations, to hide their identities when they contribute money. We're going to go back, in my view, to this cycle once again. We're in the deregulation part. The next part will be scandal. It may be this election. It may be the next election. Watch for it. And the rest of this is basically a glossary for you, a crib sheet that includes all sorts of stuff on important court cases and terminologies. So you can use that in your reporting. Thank you.
Julie, if you want to come up, I should mention that all of this is online, so don't freak out if you didn't read that very quickly. It's all if you go to Nieman.org, and you can, is it Nieman.org?
On the conference website,
Yeah.
behind the names of the speakers, you will now find their presentation.
So those are all attached online for you. And as Julie comes up, she's going to load it. Julie Bykowicz is a national political reporter with Bloomberg, and she writes about the business of campaigns, big money groups, and the influence industry, and previously was at the Baltimore Sun. Go ahead, Julie.
Hi. Thank you for having me. So we heard a lot from Eliza about all of the different types of spending, all of the different groups to watch, the different categories of ways that people spend money in elections. And what I'm going to talk to you guys about this morning is one very specific vehicle for campaign spending that is great for you all to watch because it is fully disclosed, so there are lots of ways to report out stories. And that's super PACs with my little Superman cape here. So I came up with 16 to watch in 2016, mainly just because I like the two 16s. But in reality, there are going to be dozens and possibly even hundreds that are worth kind of keeping an eye on to see what they're up to. And again, that's all disclosed through the FEC. So you can come up with a list that makes sense for you to keep an eye on as you cover, your candidates or the states that you're working in. Okay, so first it's important to know what exactly is a super PAC, because as our last presentation pointed out, There are tons of different money groups out there. Some of them are nonprofits, some of them are super PACs, some of them are just traditional campaign accounts. So super PACs are what I like to think of them as candidate boosters. Groups that can directly help a candidate by running an ad on TV saying, elect Mitt Romney or elect Barack Obama. They can do a lot of direct advocacy on television. I even sometimes like to think of them as like a shadow campaign because they can watch what the candidate is doing and just amplify that candidate's message in a really direct way. One thing, though, that I want you all to keep in mind is that super PACs are not dark money. There are some, as Eliza pointed out, elements that are a little bit shady within these groups, a little bit hard to figure out exactly what's going on. But just in the 2012 election, 2014 and going into this one, most of the money within super PACs is disclosed. So as you're talking about these groups on television or writing about them, it's important not to make sort of false equivalencies between dark money and super PACs. They're two different things. So I like, that's wrong. It's not anonymous donors. It's a cool cartoon, though, so I do like this. And this is essentially what we've seen super PACs do in the last couple of cycles. They're these giant behemoths that, mostly through television advertising so far, have been out there attacking opponents for the candidates that they're trying to help. So I would just amend this to say donors, and maybe even wealthy donors, because a lot of the super PAC money is gigantic checks that are much greater than just your traditional campaign finance limits. We went through how we got here, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on this. But I did want to point out that really, if you had to pick sort of one revolutionary figure in the super PAC world, I'd probably call that person either Sheldon Adelson or Newt Gingrich. And the two of them worked together, although within the legal limits, during the 2012 election to really sort of display the power that a super PAC has. Newt Gingrich wasn't really in the discussion until a super PAC helping him, funded almost exclusively by a billionaire named Sheldon Adelson, came in and was able to do lots of campaign advertising on Newt's behalf, propping him up at a time when in other cycles, he would have just simply run out of money and had to drop out of the race. So although he didn't ultimately win the nomination, he really caused a lot of problems for Mitt Romney, caused everyone to spend a lot more money. And I think the fear that parties and candidates have in some ways is that it's not impossible to imagine a scenario where a person like Sheldon is actually successful in funding a super PAC to a level that is able to get a candidate elected. So getting into the actual groups that you should watch, and again, this is available for you guys to take a look at after the presentation. The first group I like to think of as presidential pals. And that's what we've heard most about so far this year as the candidates start announcing that they are in fact actual candidates. I just kind of listed 7 of them here. As you know, there are lots of candidates and potential candidates who will be on the Republican side alone. So I probably could have come up with 16 just presidential Republican contender super PACs. But just to point out some of the interesting issues within each of these, skipping down to 2 for a second, Jeb Bush and his Right to Rise super PAC are really pushing the limits of what a super PAC has traditionally done and can do in a really interesting way that can make for lots of great stories. And we can talk about that more in the question and answer session. But he's directly sort of involved in the fundraising for the super PAC because since he's not a candidate, he doesn't run afoul of any laws that way, although there's certainly an appearance issue. Carly for America, I point out because this is just sort of an exhibit A of what the FEC could, and some would argue should be doing, and just is simply not. It is illegal to have a candidate's name in a group like this unless it's a draft group, but we'll see if the FEC does anything. She just declared her candidacy last week, I think. For Scott Walker and Chris Christie, we've got Unintimidated and America Leads. And I put those guys up there because I think we might see sort of a Newt Gingrich, Sheldon Adelson effect with one or both of those groups, where you really start looking at, are there just a couple of people spending a lot of money on these candidates, or are they getting broad support? America's Liberty with Rand Paul, he's sort of traditionally been a very good small donor fundraiser, so it'll be interesting to see how and if he can lock down big money through a super PAC. And then, of course, we've got Ted Cruz's strange operation Keep the Promise, and then Keep the Promise 1, Keep the Promise 2, and Keep the Promise 3. It's this network of super PACs that some of his wealthy donors have decided to start, and really what you've got there is each donor family running their own super PAC. And that leads me to what we have now, which is that super PACs have really become the must-have accessory for the super rich. You know, why give all of your millions of dollars to another group when you can just simply start your own group and directly control how you're spending the money? And so I would sort of argue that the Ted Cruz super PAC constellation falls into that category, as do some of the other niche super PACs out there. But beyond just the candidates, there are wealthy people who have started super PACs to sort of further their own pet projects. Not saying that's good or bad, it's just sort of the reality here. Ending Spending, which is a group set up by the Ricketts family. You're all Chicagoans probably familiar with that family. They've been very involved in raising money and spending money in presidential elections, and in 2014. We'll look to see what they do this time. Tom Steyer has his environmentally focused Next Gen, Michael Bloomberg, who has a number of projects. I just pulled one, Independence USA, which is an anti-gun group. American Unity, it'll be interesting to see how they work in this election, since it's largely sort of a Republican donor group that it cares a lot about gay marriage and other gay rights issues. And then wrapping up, again, I would argue with some of the panelists yesterday, and Eliza as well, saying, you know, really they are essentially a new political party out there. So we no longer just have the RNC and DNC, but we have these whole third-party operations going on. So just a couple more to keep an eye on throughout the cycle. These are the groups that I put up here, are the groups that are really spending money in a variety of ways, not just for one candidate, but for many. And so I would keep an eye on all of these guys to see what sort of party-like activities they do. And of course, I also wanted to plug very quickly Open Secrets, which has been great about ranking and sort of putting FEC information into a more digestible format. So that is it. And I'm excited to talk to you guys about what your questions are.
Panelist is Andy Kroll, and while he fixes his mic, Andy spent the past 6 years working in San Francisco and Washington with Mother Jones. And was yesterday your last day? It was, because he's going to be talking about money, but he will soon be joining the National Journal as a staff correspondent. You got it? Yeah.
Does it work?
We will find out.
Awesome. Is this on? Yes? Great. All right, so for all you Star Wars nuts out there, we are going to the dark side. Whether you like that or not, here we are. I'm going to be talking about dark money, which is the evil sibling to super PACs. This is the money that is not disclosed. These are the ads that purport to be about issues, that purport to be about something other than the candidates that they're very clearly trying to elect. I'll give you a crash course on that, and then I'm sure you'll have questions, because this is very complicated stuff. I've been writing about it for years and continue to learn something every day. So here's a little trail to kick us off. So who are the big dark money players? Our good friend Karl Rove and his group Crossroads GPS, or group he helped inspire and guide. This is one of the biggest dark money players in American politics, so much so that it has reportedly, as one of your colleagues reported, caught the attention of the IRS in a not good way. We have our good friends Charles and David Koch, the billionaire industrialists, head of Koch Industries, really the main players in this dark money space in American politics and the policy debate in America today. And then here I've thrown in a group called Patriot Majority USA, which is a pretty big player on the Democratic liberal side, though by and large, the data show a lot of the dark money action is really on the right, on the conservative side, and we'll get more into that in a minute here. So legally, what are these groups? 501c4, it's a part of the tax code. When you think of a group like this, you think of maybe an NRA, a Sierra Club. There are a lot of sort of household names that are these organizations. However, this part of the tax code has now become the playground, if you will, for wealthy donors, for political operatives, for political activists to stretch the law and to spend tens, hundreds of millions of anonymous dollars on American elections. Labor unions I will include here because they are also a nonprofit. They do disclose their money somewhat more than a 501c4 does. Obviously, that's their members, but in a chart I'll show you in a little bit, labor money is included, and I wanted to have that in there as well. And they are a big part of nonprofit spending on elections. In trade organizations, this is sort of the new tool that we see. Typically, you think of a trade organization, some kind of, representing American Trucking Association or the American Petroleum Institute, someone like representing an actual industry. But what we're seeing now, especially with the Koch brothers, is using this part of the tax code to bring big donors together and to pool their money and put it into various nonprofit groups, more dark money groups, spending money on elections. The Koch brothers group under this designation is called Freedom Partners. And Julie mentioned Freedom Partners Action Fund, which is their super PAC offshoot. And there's a whole network, which I'll show you in a second here. But these are the three categories you really want to bear in mind. And you want to make sure when you're reporting, you sort of keep them straight and understand how each of them work. They are different in the nuances here. So how has this spending worked? As you can see, this is from the great folks at OpenSecrets.org, Center for Responsive Politics. As you can see, this sort of dark money spending, 2000, 2002, 2004, not really on the radar. But as we get into 2008 and 2010, the Citizens United decision comes down the pipeline. This sort of spending goes off the charts. I mean, it's after 2010, you see the creation of Crossroads GPS. You see these nonprofit groups really understand that, again, the Federal Election Commission is hamstrung. That might be putting it nicely. The Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, which has oversight over these groups, is afraid to do its job, is underfunded, and doesn't seem to have the manpower to actually track this kind of spending. And so this spending goes off the charts. It was more than $300 million in 2012. Obviously, 2014 is a midterm election, but as midterms go, still a new record. In 2016 is on pace to be absolutely bonkers. The Koch brothers and their network alone are trying to raise almost $900 million to spend in 2015 and 2016 on elections and also the issues that they support. But obviously, that just blows up this entire chart if that happens. So 2016 is going to be a huge year for dark money. So I wanted to make a point here about the kind of ads that you'll see. So if you're out reporting, you're watching the news, you're watching the ads, you're following these groups, what you will often see is something along these lines. And this is from an outfit called the American Energy Alliance, a dark money group that we don't know who funds it, but we can probably guess. So as you'll see, this is the end. Protect American-made energy. Vote no on Obama's failing energy policy. So any reasonable person would look at this and say, probably anti-Obama. They probably don't want you to vote for the president. They probably support his opponent. But the American Energy Alliance says this is what a so-called issue advocacy ad. This is not political in any way. It's about an issue. It's about energy policy. It's about gas prices. And this is how these groups do their business. This is how they fly under the radar and supposedly stay within the law of the IRS. I think that this is kind of a sham, and the more that people report on that and bring this kind of ad and bring attention to it, report on it, reveals this for what it actually is, which is political activity, but under the guise of, oh, this is just about an issue. We don't really care about the result of this election. We're just focusing on our little pet project here. So keep an eye out for this kind of stuff. You will see so much of it in the next 18 months. Ah, yes. Just want you to admire that for a minute. Again, from the great folks at Open Secrets. This is the Koch brothers' sort of political machinery, if you will. I've looked at this for years, and I still haven't figured out exactly how it all goes together. This is what we're dealing with now, though. This is the complexity of the whole dark money universe. And this is obviously the most extreme example, at least the most extreme example we know of how money moves between groups. And there's a 501c5, a 6 group, a trade association here. There are 501c4s. There are limited liability corporations, which were mentioned earlier. And it's this huge, massive network, and kind of incredible. And at the end, you'll see the organization, money moves in between to fund groups and Americans for Job Security, the very benign sounding names, but with very impactful results on the election. So just wanted you to have that to see what we're dealing with now. All right, so that's sort of the problem. What's going on, how we got here. I want to give some idea of how to chip away at it. I call it my Tim the Toolman Taylor approach. He's a longtime fan of home improvement. When this beat is about trying to shed light on money that is intentionally opaque, you have to throw every tool that you have at your disposal at this problem. I mean, that's everything from, well, this is an example of a story that I did about this family in Michigan, the Devos family. It's a story that involved open records requests, knocking on doors, obviously traveling to my home state of Michigan and tracking people down. I mean, when you're doing this beat, you have to know not only the paper trail, but it's a human beat as well. I mean, the FEC reports will not tell you anything about American or Crossroads GPS or the Koch network, or for instance, this story that I did about Michigan. You have to get out there. Same with this story about the Republican Governors Association. It was a mix of documents, a mix of literally going to offices in DC and standing outside and pouting until someone talked to me. And you can do that on your beat as well. And you'd be amazed how much you can get out of that. People don't like awkward encounters, and they will give you what you want if you just don't go away. Some resources for you. Again, this is online, but the political nonprofit section at Open Secrets, invaluable. That's where that graph came from earlier. National Center for Charitable Statistics. Form 990s are the annual reports for all of these, for 501c4 groups, Karl Rove's group, Koch groups. This is a website where they have a list of them. Conservative Transparency is a nice tool. It's a partisan tool from the folks at American Bridge, the Democratic super PAC, but they have a lot of data there and it's helpful. And this last one right here is sort of a hidden gem. If you're looking for historic information, you want to nonprofit data going back in time to give you a sense of where these groups have come from, I found that incredibly useful as well. And then the last thing I would just say, this is sort of an interesting story, is that on this dark money beat, the same sort of human dynamics on reporting apply. People have grudges. People get mad when they're slighted. Consultants get angry when they don't get business. This particular story, I was just having lunch. Believe it or not, Republican donors have lunch with Mother Jones reporters. I was just having lunch with someone, and she's like, "Oh, hey, did you hear about what they raised at the last Koch conference?" I'm like, "Well, no, obviously I haven't. I wasn't there, clearly." And she told me about it, and we talked about it, and you nail it down. And I just would stress that even though this is the dark side, to end on the note we started on, the same principles about reporting apply, and you'd be amazed how much you can pry out of people by being persistent, by hounding them, and just taking the time and being there and not going away on it. And this was one of those examples. So, and happy to take questions. I'm sure there are gazillions of them. So, thanks.
So our last panelist is Peter Overby. Before we get to questions, thanks so much, you guys, I know everybody probably has questions, so write them down, and we're running really well on time, so after Peter, we'll hopefully have plenty of time for questions. Peter obviously also covers campaign finance, and I don't know if you guys heard, because he's a public radio colleague, I have to plug his great story that was on yesterday morning about Jeb Bush, and the $100 million, is it, that will be raised in the next couple of weeks, so go ahead.
For the super PAC.
Yes.
Yes. of course, for the super PAC, because he doesn't have a campaign committee, because he's not a candidate. Okay, so I wanted to talk some about things away from the presidential campaign, trying to get more local. All of this stuff eventually filters down to the local level. You know, the ads run on the local TV stations, the ground organizations are knocking on doors locally, things like that. Obviously, this is less true if you don't live in a primary state or a Senate battleground state or a state with hot House races. But I'm going to tell you anyway. First of all, the donors are out there to be looked at. You know, you can see who in your community is a big donor, kind of across the board. You know, they're supporting presidential candidates. They're also probably supporting a lot of other people, and they probably have a reason for doing that perhaps goes beyond just party loyalty or altruism. There are also industries that are connected to the big donors. For instance, in the 2014 cycle, there was an issue with Koch Industries, Michigan subsidiary in the Michigan Senate race. Democratic opposition research people are now looking at the Koch Industries in Florida. So the Koch brothers may be in Wichita and New York City, but they have a big industry, they have a big conglomerate with a lot of industry interests scattered all over the country. Excuse me. In the House and Senate races, just like the presidential candidates, these guys more and more are raising money around the country. A lot of states, there isn't enough money to be raised in state to finance a Senate campaign anymore. So they go to New York, they go to Chicago, they go to big cities, and they also do a lot of outreach to other big donors who are scattered around the country. And as far as the presidential race goes, one of my favorite stories is the campaigns. Once they get rolling, you know, they come to town for an event, they blow out of town as fast as they can. They've left a lot of money behind, and sometimes they've left a lot of creditors behind. So, for instance, Newt Gingrich, I did a story on him last cycle. He ran up some millions of dollars in debt by the time he dropped out. And so I started looking at the list and calling people, and wound up doing a story on a community, or a kind of a public theater in Spokane, Washington, where he'd had an event. I don't know why he was there, but they'd charged it to the campaign. The campaign hadn't paid the bill. So I called the theater to talk to the manager. Hey, what was the event? You know, what's it mean to you that you're not getting paid? It was a meaningful difference. You know, they don't have the money to throw around that a presidential campaign does. So the presidential candidates do not have a lot of fiscal responsibility. They're only, in Iowa for as long as it takes to win Iowa, and they just leave things behind. Senate and House candidates can't do that because it's their home turf. But presidential campaigns often run up debt, and it's often looking at the debtors, which is they're all listed on a form in the campaign's FEC reports. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the way national politics is starting to run down, more than trickle down, run down into state and even local politics. The idea of the state party kind of being the power center for that political party is kind of fading away because, again, there's such a money chase going on that the candidates and the operatives are looking all over the country to finance stuff at the state level. And that money is going through groups in Washington, like the governors' associations are big players in this. There's Democratic and Republican governors' associations, there's lieutenant governors' associations, attorney general associations, and for state legislative candidates, the Republican State Leadership Committee and the Democratic Legislative Leadership Committee. So when these people get elected, it's not because just because they raised money locally or within the state. It's because there are rich people all over the country that are putting big money into these Washington-based organizations that are helping to shape our advertising in, sometimes even have ground troops in the state and local races. Finally, this influence of national money coming down into the states doesn't just apply during elections. There's the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is conservative, and the State Innovation Exchange Council. State Innovation Exchange, which is liberal. They bring people together, state legislators and other interested parties. In ALEC, that means corporate lobbyists, typically, and they talk about model legislation. Now they call it model policy because they got in trouble with the IRS calling it model legislation. And then the legislators take this stuff home and they try to enact it. That's how stand your ground laws got spread around. There are a lot of small government cut taxes types of legislation that have been spread around to various states through ALEC. State Innovation Exchange, also called SIX, just started up last year, basically, and they are trying to emulate that, for liberal causes, social safety net kinds of things. And finally, for the state political money, if you don't know the website followthemoney.org, it's worth looking at. This is it's the National Institution on Money and State Politics. They pull together data from all states. So you can search within a state, you can search across states by donor, which can be really useful. The website's kind of idiosyncratic, but if you spend a little time with it, you'll figure it out, and it will tell you what you need to know. So, thank you very much.
Do you want to come up, Andy? So as our panelists are coming up and you guys are getting, I think there's a microphone that's going to go around for questions. I just had a first question to kind of kick it all off and wanted to ask you, because we sort of heard, and we've kind of heard these comments about the FEC and its inefficacy. I don't know what term you want to use. But I wanted to ask all of you, is there anyone in Congress, do we see any movement on trying to tighten any of these regulations?
No.
Yeah.
And this is no. Eliza hasn't, okay.
There is no actual legislation to strengthen the FEC, but this has been talked about. And there are even draft proposals out there for how to strengthen the FEC or create a new structure for the FEC, such as putting a commissioner in charge, something like the FCC. And on the campaign trail in 2008, Barack Obama said he wanted to change the FEC, that was going to be one of a number of reforms that he would institute once elected. Of course, none of those happened, including the one around the FEC. And the simple answer is politics. Obama did not have the political capital on Capitol Hill after enacting the health care law, which was a pretty big political lift. He really couldn't go back to members of Congress and say, oh, and by the way, now I want to get in this really turgid, hostile, partisanly charged fight over the Federal Election Commission. Members of Congress don't want to change the FEC. They sort of set it up the way it was to begin with because they didn't want a really tough cop on their beat. So no, there isn't anyone out there to reform the FEC.
And the other thing is that conservatives believe that the FEC is doing the job it's supposed to do, which is take a critical view of the laws and the regulations and don't stretch them beyond where where they were written exactly to go. So, as long as they hold to that and Republicans have at least one House of Congress, the FEC will stay the way it is, it seems to me.
Okay, great. We have some time for questions. So we have a microphone that's going around. If you can just identify yourself. I see it in the back there. You want to go back? Yeah.
Yeah, give us questions.
Hey guys, I'm Peter Hamby. Andy, you talked a little bit about labor. Whenever you talk to Freedom Partners, the Chamber, really anyone on the Republican side of the apparatus, they always throw their hands up and say this is a double standard. Organized labor is spending just as much money as we are. Is there anything analogous? Are they building anything, spending as much, laying any comparable groundwork to, what's happening on the right, or is that a false analogy?
I'd say that's a false analogy while not saying that you shouldn't look at labor as well. It's harder to do because, obviously when they spend money politically, it'll show up in open secrets. And you can also dig into their L201s, whatever the form is they file with the Department of Labor, which gives the whole outlay of what a labor union spends. But, in all honesty, it's a false equivalence. You have to do your job looking at both sides. Labor unions are also just generally dwindling in terms of what they can spend on politics. And in a lot of cases, they just give their money to a Priorities USA Action Super PAC and let them handle it. But there is nothing comparable to the Koch network, to the size of Crossroads GPS, to the whole constellation of nonprofit groups on that side. And also the comparison doesn't quite work because where do labor unions' money come from? They do come from their members by and large, whereas a nonprofit group or Freedom Partners, the clearinghouse for Koch money, or Crossroads GPS, there is no disclosure of where that comes from. So if people get that talking point back, my response has always been, well, yeah, we cover labor and we write about what they do, but we're not going to compare them to what you guys are doing. You guys are on your own here, and you've built something that has no comparable. There's no equivalent on the liberal side.
But I would say that there are Democratic groups, liberal groups that are trying to sort of get into this territory. And, the best example of that is Obama's campaign apparatus, that became Organizing for America at this point, I think.
Organizing for Action.
Or Organizing for Action. It's had a number of different names. But that's another example of a group that is technically a dark money group. It's a nonprofit. It has a lot of support within the group that is left over from the campaign in terms of email addresses, data points, outreach, even aides that have stuck around. So I'm really interested to see what that does going forward. Now, they have voluntarily disclosed donors, but again, they're not legally required to do so. So what's the check on that? How do you know that? You just have to trust that they're telling you everyone who's giving. So those types of groups, and we'll see how it grows or shrinks over the years. I think there's always something to keep an eye on in sort of the liberal side of the equation as well.
Jason Noble, Des Moines Register. For as long as I've been covering campaign finance and campaign finance reform, the argument is that if we just got rid of all the limits and mandated transparency and reporting, that all these problems would go away. Is there any evidence that that's true?
Well, I'd say two things. One is the argument has shifted, because at one time the argument was that we should have full disclosure with transparency. Actually, the argument has now shifted that we should have unlimited spending and not have transparency. Pretty much every day you'll see an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal or in some conservative publication that says disclosure is bad. It's a way to intimidate donors. It's a way to intimidate political speech. And I think that the bottom line is not what we think. The bottom line is what voters think. We could sit here and argue all day about how many angels dance on the head of a pin or what the theoretical perfect balance is between regulation and free speech. But I personally, in my gut, don't think that voters are going to be happy with a system that involves unregulated spending without full disclosure, which is currently what we have, and we're heading toward more of that. And I said in my presentation, I think inevitably it's going to blow up. And already you do see candidates are sensitive to this. They're sensitive to the optics.
Well, the other thing is that the idea that taking off the caps would make all the problems go away. It would make the problems go away for the politicians. It would not clean up the government, which is the point of campaign finance laws to begin with. So, if the candidate can raise, $10 million from Sheldon Adelson, and Sheldon Adelson doesn't have to be identified, and the candidate gets elected, where are we?
Yeah, I'd add one point as well, which is the demand for groups that do not disclose their donors won't go away, because you see in super PACs by and large are motivated, often ideological donors who and also incredibly wealthy. The rare glimpses we've gotten of the donors to these dark money groups are folks who maybe have more of an agenda. They're corporations, they are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and they don't want their name on any kind of disclosure form because they are supporting this group for a very specific reason. And if you're a publicly traded corporation, your name gets out there, you're behind this particular effort, it's bad for business. And so while the full transparency argument is sort of tossed out there, well, we should just do this and the problems will go away, you'll always have this sort of dark side because there will always be a demand for it.
Can I ask a question about the optics of this? Andy, you had I think it was a couple weeks ago, a piece about the Koch brothers and the notion of transparency and how they're even thinking a little bit more about that. Can you explain that a little bit more? And if you think this is a shift or an opening, or I don't know how you would describe it.
Yeah, they are tiptoeing into the public a little bit more, which has been interesting to see. They're a little more friendly to folks like us. At least I've strangely had that experience. I think they've just, in terms of the Kochs and their company, they've just been pummeled in the press for just being so secretive and so reactionary and all kinds of things. And I think this is as much a PR move for them as anything. Does this bring with it actual transparency to what they're doing, to this incredibly complicated choose your own adventure map that I put up there? No, it doesn't. So in practice and in substance, we're still kind of where we were 2 or 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Want to go up here? Over here?
Hi, I'm Jillian Weinberger. I'm with The Takeaway and the Center for Investigative Reporting. I have a question about how this plays out locally, and maybe, Niala, this might be a question for you too. How do local voters see or think about Rahm Emanuel amassing how much? 44 million?
Well, it was about 30 in this past cycle. But
Okay,
44, yeah. And actually, this is all on WBEZ.org. My great colleague, Chris Hagan, scraped all of the data and put it all together. Because at the local level, this is something that's really hard, a little harder to find. So if you go to WBEZ.org/campaign cash, you can see all of the money, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess how do local voters see this? Have they responded to this? What do they think about these campaigns becoming more national? If all this national money's flowing in, it seems that it might be harder for local voters to get the candidate's ear. And
right. Well, Mayor Emanuel won, so I think that's kind of the simple answer to the question, right? But I think that I think that the calculus into how he won, how much the money played a role in that, I think was an important thing, and I think it was when you looked at. So we had a runoff. So people who aren't familiar with what happened, this has never happened before in sort of the current history of how there isn't really a primary system. There's sort of a first campaign, and if you don't get above the threshold, then it goes to a runoff, and that actually happened. So it was February 24th was the first election, and Mayor Emanuel did not make it above that 50% +1 threshold. So then it went to this runoff that we had a couple of weeks ago. And so in that 6-week period, then it was sort of an interesting time of even more spending that maybe people hadn't planned for. And his opponent, Jesus Garcia, who was a Cook County commissioner, was backed by the Chicago Teachers Union, and so had that kind of money, but certainly nothing on the level of Mayor Emanuel. I think Chicago might be an unusual situation because of Mayor Emanuel and because of his ties, and we saw that with the fundraising that he had. A lot of that was coming from the East and West Coast as well. And I'm not sure how much of that is just a function of his ties to Washington as opposed to this being a normal kind of mayoral race. Certainly when I know from the reporting that we did, I think this number, 30 million for a mayoral race, I don't think there's any comparison to that.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I also
Julie.
wanted to say one fun storyline that you'll see, no doubt, is that when an out-of-state group or out-of-state donors come into a local race or even a Senate race in Montana, the next thing you'll see, most likely, is the candidate who is not benefiting from that money will put up ads saying, do we want to elect a person who's being funded by these Washington millionaires? So there's a lot of good reporting to do on sort of the push and pull between the candidates and the outside groups and how they're sort of playing off one another. And also a lot of hypocrisy stories, because then those same candidates who are putting up ads saying we don't want out-of-state money are also taking out-of-state money.
Which was a storyline that Commissioner Garcia tried to have here, that Mayor Emanuel was the 1% candidate. And obviously it didn't work.
I'd add one thing real quick too. When you're thinking about telling these stories, reporting these stories, as much as you can ground them in perhaps something local or something state-based, I think really brings it home. I mean, one of the stories that I did that got a lot of feedback interesting was about judicial elections and the amount of money going into those races. And you do see large corporations or major businesses in the state become involved because they have business before the court, potential business before the court. And those are the kind of stories that people really get fired up about. And well, my judge is being backed by State Farm, and there's this class action suit coming through, and wait, what does that mean for just justice? And so rooting those stories in something that people understand or something that's in their community, even for a national reporter, I've tried to do that, with a feature piece here and there, and it's always gotten a good response.
Eliza, did you want to add
Just very briefly, also the super PAC money and the big outside money has a bigger impact on the state and local races. So there's a grain of truth to saying that the super PACs will not decide the presidential election. On that level, national politics really do kind of act as a wave over the money. But when you get down to a little local race, a big amount of money like that can make a huge difference. So it's really worth watching.
And we did see that with Chicago Forward, which funded a lot of in aldermanic races, funded candidates that were candidates that were supporting Mayor Emanuel. And actually in some of those races, despite all of that money, some of those aldermen lost. So, and again, that's a very local politics, local matter. Those are ward races where some of them came down to literally 50 votes. So, but that did happen in Chicago. It was actually pretty mixed, I would say. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Laura Haim from Canal Plus French Television. What are the regulations regarding foreign money coming to the campaigns, and what's your view on the Clinton Foundation at this moment?
Well, there is a prohibition on foreign money being used for campaigns, but there is no prohibition on foreign money coming into tax-exempt organizations. And as I said earlier, that's a real danger territory. I think the Clinton Foundation story is important, but I don't think it's the whole story. I think that there are a number of other groups accepting undisclosed, unregulated money that may well be taking foreign money, and we just don't know it. And I think that's something to watch.
And that'll be a source-based reporting trick for you all, is to, there's not going to be paperwork on that often, or there's not going to be a public record on it. It's going to be interviewing people, talking to people who are in these organizations, disgruntled former employees, current employees. That'll be something to sort of track throughout the election.
Let's go in the back, all the way in the back, and then work our way back up front.
Chris Gates with the Sunlight Foundation. The conversation has been a great deal about how donors might have a desire to not have their contributions be transparent. It's also worth pointing out for folks who will be covering the next cycle that elected officials also sometimes have a strong desire for their donations not to be made public. And it's really important for anybody covering a Senate race to recognize that the Senate still refuses to modernize their disclosure rules that they impose on themselves, and that Senate campaigns disclose on a quarterly basis. The reports are not required to be online. They're not required even to be machine readable. Sometimes campaigns in the last cycle, there were good examples in, I think, Iowa and Louisiana, where campaigns actually went out of their way to file reports in ways that reporters couldn't figure out who they received money from until the election had already passed by. So I think it's important to say it's not just the donors that have an interest sometimes in secrecy, it's elected officials and candidates themselves.
Mm-hmm. Want to go up to the front?
Hey, Dan Merricker with CNN. Just the politics of this. You've seen both Democratic candidates who are in the race talk about getting unaccounted money out of politics. And it's rang hollow a little bit for Hillary Clinton, and Bernie Sanders has been talking about it forever. Do people care enough about this to make this something they consider when they vote for a presidential candidate? And why are Secretary Clinton and Senator Sanders talking about this as a political issue?
Well, one thing is that since Citizens United, there's a lot more, there's a lot more grassroots interest in this than there was before. When McCain-Feingold was passed by Congress, it was really an inside the Beltway kind of thing. This time, there are lots of groups around the country, state level, municipal, that are really angry about Citizens United, and are people have managed to organize them. So, that only gets you so far as a viable political issue, but it's a lot further than it has been before.
And I'm interested in Hillary Clinton's rhetoric on this because she is both. When she brought up the Citizens United issue, as part of this sort of bigger, reboot, or this image she's putting out there as for the everyday people and everyday Iowans, and a woman, of the people there, and yet at the same time, we just learned that she's going to be meeting with super PAC donors, which is something that President Obama didn't originally do and then sort of backed into in the last campaign. Clinton is just going all in on that from the sounds of it. And at the same time just has to raise an insane amount of money herself for her campaign. And so the tension there, I think, is really interesting. I mean, I think that there is, Citizens United is a word that people know. It's sort of a hot button issue. I think when you say campaign finance, people kind of go, they sort of doze a little bit. But I do think within Clinton at least, and how Bernie Sanders can push her on that issue or raise these tensions between, raising $1 billion or $1.5 billion super PACs, and then her saying, "Oh, but Citizens United is bad," is something that I'll be watching for sure.
And the Democrats use the phrase unilaterally disarm all the time. I mean, that was 2012. It's now. And I think it'll be interesting to see the pushback on that, because a candidate like Bernie Sanders, although possibly not Bernie Sanders, looking at their fundraising over the years, he has an incredible small donor base. And I don't think it's as impossible as these headline candidates like Hillary Clinton seem to think it is, to really sort of spark more of a populist campaign finance movement where you just say you're not doing it and see what you can do with small dollar donors. People are very used to giving money online now, and I think we're maybe 1 or 2 cycles away from seeing someone who's just really willing to go for it and just say, no, I'm not doing the millionaire and billionaire route, and having it actually work out.
The Obama campaign did that in 2008, but even then, first of all, he wound up raising money for a super PAC, and second, the fundraising curve of the Obama campaign looked sort of like a barbell. It was, a lot of people giving at the low end, not so many people in the middle, and a lot of people giving at the high end. So, that was all within the contribution limits, but it also shows that there are lots of people who are willing to put a lot of money in.
I think there are a few things to watch on this kind of percolating voter anger over big money. One is that there are movements in the states to push for disclosure. So that's the sort of test area, and if you have stuff happening at the state level, it suggests something. It suggests that people care about this enough to take action. The second thing to watch is conservatives getting on this issue. Very interesting. On Friday, there were not 1, not 2, but 3 commentary pieces by conservative voices on this issue. One was Lee Hamilton, did some kind of op-ed on big money is bad. There's a new Republican pro-reform group out there. There was a piece about that. And then I think it was the U.S. Catholic Conference issued something about how big money is bad because we need to go help poor people and people who are on the margins. And I thought, now that's very interesting. And the fourth thing I would say to watch is the Tea Party. You know, Dave Bratt won partly because he said Eric Cantor was in the pocket of moneyed interests. So that's going to be a very interesting dynamic on the presidential campaign trail, where you have these Republican candidates who are trying to scoop up small dollars from Tea Party donors. And if they end up on the wrong side of this, that might come back to bite them too. And the final thing is, going forward, what form are the reforms going to take? When we finally do have the scandal and we have some kind of push for reform, I think it's probably going to take the form of something called floors, not ceilings, where you have small donations matched by public money. And you have this guy, John Sarbanes, in the House that's pushing that now. That's sort of the most likely model that you're going to see both sides coming together on.
Mm-hmm.
So,
let's go up here.
Hi, I'm Patrick. Hi, I'm Patrick Liao. I just wanted, so I think we get a sense of the scale and the complexity of campaign financing right now and the uneasiness that it elicits from the voting populace. But I mean, in the past 2 cycles alone, there have been plenty of examples of candidates who are well-heeled and who are well-funded, but whose campaigns still flounder. And I think the literature is still mixed on whether, you know, how much money actually determines the outcomes of the elections. So I guess I'm just looking for a general sense of just like why, beyond the kind of scale of uneasiness we have about it, why money should be a primary focus of how we cover this election coming up.
I think that you know, it's one way of gauging support, and in this sort of stage that we're at now with the presidential campaign, very early, where we're not hearing a lot of policy positions, we're not seeing them out on the stump all the time. So when we get our first big FEC reports, that's really the first gauge that we have of what kind of support they're drawing, you know, what industries, what groups of people, what regions of the country. And you know, certainly the campaigns grow much more complicated as they go on and we get closer to actually, you know, casting votes. But in the early stages, I look at money as just a way to kind of assess where people are at and where they want to go in terms of shaping their campaigns. I don't know if anyone else wants.
I mean, I'd say we want accountability and transparency in American politics. That's served us well in the economic sphere, and it serves us well in the political sphere. Since we don't have transparency as a result of the laws that exist, it is somewhat incumbent upon us and on the outside groups that follow this to sort of bring these things to light. It's important.
One last thing, I mean, going back to Sheldon Adelson, casino tycoon, Las Vegas, runs Las Vegas Sands. I mean, in his case, you know, he's going to be a primary financier of the presidential race, probably Senate races as well. And you know, he has a very specific agenda. There are things that he cares about. Top of that list is banning online gambling. And any candidate who is going to court him for support and that he's going to invest in is probably going to be on board with banning online gambling, just as he wants, because that's good for brick and mortar gambling. And so I think that bringing those stories and bringing that to the attention of voters really does matter, because it has a direct bearing on the policies of the candidates who are, you know, going to possibly run the country or be in the Senate.
So you've talked several times about how, you know, one possibility is that this cycles through, and if we reach back to Watergate, we've seen that you drew it sort of as a triangle, and that it will cycle through and we'll come to scandal and then we'll have reform. But we're living in this moment that we talk about often as, you know, polarization, and there's a sort of sense of like voter disengagement and desperation with the political process in general. And Peter, you mentioned that there's a sense of, you know, Citizens United has really, voters are upset about this. And I just wonder if you could speak to a sort of different issue, which is that instead of voters getting upset and demanding reform, what ends up happening is just further innovation with the political process and just voter disengagement. And the risk of that, and, you know, sort of as the political junkies all hanging out here, if there's something that like how can media and campaign folks, I just wonder if you can respond to that risk, right? That voters just are going to say politics are now for the super wealthy and the political class, and they're not even about us anymore, particularly in this moment where the hot button issue is income inequality,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I would say a couple things about that. One is that there were some stories in the last election that were very concerning about the absence of competition. People who just weren't even running. You had races where, you had a district that had been gerrymandered and the person ran and didn't even have someone running against them. That is very concerning. I, however, have a lot of faith in our system. I think it has a way of being self-correcting. I think we have a self-correcting system, and we haven't reached the tipping point yet. And right now, a lot of polls show that voters say a pox on both their houses. But I do think one side or the other is going to pay political prices for this. And I do think we're going to get to a Lincoln bedroom foreign money Enron moment. That's what ushered in McCain-Feingold. It's just going to be inevitable. And I don't think we have a sufficiently disengaged electorate now that people are just going to roll over and say, oh, well, rich people run the company, but we don't care. No, that's not America. We're going to see some kind of reaction.
Be real brief, Peter, so that we can fit one more question.
Okay, if I can just put in a quick plug for a book called Buying the Vote by a guy named Robert Mutch, M-U-T-C-H. It's a history of campaign finance in America. And the things that we're seeing now have been seen several times before. The debate over disclosure, it goes back at least to the early part of the 20th century. So if you go back to 1907, the things that led up to that, the enactment of the Tillman Act, which banned corporate money in campaigns, it was Teddy Roosevelt getting caught taking a lot of secret money from insurance companies. So, at that point, you still, you had the beginning of the reforms after the Gilded Age, and then the reformer gets nailed. So, the scales do tip, and, we're waiting. They may not tip again, you're right, but just have to see.
I'm afraid that is all we have time. Oh, go ahead, David.
To impose my...
Very quickly, David.
As a former reporter, I have a four-part question, none of which are related to each other.
And it's a comment rather than a question?
I totally agree that the prodigious flow of money in politics is it's a reflection of the Gilded Age in which we live, and it's a bad thing. It seems like from a reportorial standpoint, though, it becomes more powerful when you link contributions to, when you can show motive and result. Koch brothers are viewed as ideological givers, but they're actually an industry. And if you look at the composition of particularly the Republican side, but not exclusively the House Energy and Commerce Committee, they're pretty big supporters of most of the members there, and there's some good reporting done on their influence on the choice of a chair. So what advice do you have for these reporters on sort of making that linkage so that it's not just an abstract notion of there being too much money in politics? I just want to make a point on your point on the guy who beat Cantor. While you said that, I just looked up his donor list. Pretty rich with corporate donors now. So apparently he's adapted nicely to the system.
Good story.
And then I want you to answer the first point. Is there something, given the congressional resistance to this, do you think there are things that can be done by executive action that could help lift the veil a little bit on all this? And then after all those questions, I just want to make one final point, which is this. I started reporting during the post-Watergate era when all these reforms came into place with the best of intentions. There was the scandal you talked about during Watergate and corporate influence and so on. And I, in principle, am a big campaign finance reformer, but what I've seen over 40 years is we've basically succeeded in making the system sneakier, but I'm not sure we've achieved the goal of keeping money out in that we create reforms and then we create a cottage industry for lawyers whose job it is to find ways around the system. And that's one of the reasons why we have all this undisclosed money. I always thought maybe it's better to attack the campaign finance problem from the demand side than from the supply side and make campaigns more affordable, making communications cheaper. But then broadcasters are special interests too.
So you have two options. You can answer either executive action
Choose any one of the
or
things.
I'll do
advice.
the first part.
Okay, go ahead, Andy.
So the first part. So one of the stories that I put up there again was about this family in Michigan, the Devos family. But what the story was about was how Michigan became a right-to-work state. Michigan, the cradle of organized labor. And my approach to that story was that that episode happened. It was reported in the Times briefly, and obviously in the local press, happened and was forgotten. But it being my home state and kind of knowing people there, thought, okay, maybe I'll revisit this and see how this actually worked, and see, where did the money come from? How is it spent? Whose arms were broken to make this happen? And it really did happen. I mean, the beginning of the story is, basically opens in a back room at a restaurant with a bunch of out-of-state donors who basically came in and tell this lawmaker, literally, you have to grow a pair and pass this bill. So don't be afraid to revisit something that seemed, an episode, a passage of a bill, a campaign, something like that, where you have the benefit of hindsight, and you have the benefit of a little bit of time as well. You're not on your whatever that day's deadline, that week's deadline, and you can really sort of dissect what happened, and you can see how this quid pro quo, you can see how this give and take actually happens, and it's really instructive. And that piece did really well, and sort of kind of rewrote the story on that whole episode in Michigan.
Peter?
The executive action question. There's been a lot of pressure on Obama to issue an executive order requiring disclosure of campaign contributions by federal contractors. And that seems to me to be ripe for a lawsuit. So, he's been sitting on this for a long time without doing it. And if he does do it, then it'll sit for a lot longer. Beyond that, I've not heard anyone float any ideas. If you have some, I'd love to hear them.
Well, the IRS probably has some authority to force some disclosure. The FCC may have some authority to force some disclosure. On the IRS point, you can imagine what the reaction would be if there were such an order. They could be much more scrutinizing of these, various C4s, 6s, and so on. But it would engender quite a fury.
And their budget would be cut again.
Eliza.
There has been some executive action that actually has brought about positive change, including better disclosure at the FCC, so that we at least can see how much money some of these Koch nonprofits spent. I would push beyond this idea of the demand side. I'm worried about that because let's say we have some Treasury money to pay for ads. People being who they are, they're still going to raise more and spend more. I think it makes more sense to go to the floors and to increase engagement through small donors. The third thing I would say is that we can throw up our hands and say nothing will ever happen and people are divided, but there is the possibility of a culture shift, and frankly, there already is a culture shift. Hillary Clinton's foundation is disclosing its donors because public perception was so negative that they were under public pressure to do that. Organizing for Action is disclosing its donors for the same reason. I think it's entirely possible that if voters get angry enough and that there's enough public pressure, that there'll be a culture shift where it's really not okay to be a nonprofit that doesn't disclose its donors. I would actually argue that the tax-exempt community would be ill-advised to ignore this, and that if they were to get ahead of the problem, they would see they're getting a huge black eye, and they should start to bring about that culture shift themselves. There's also a culture shift going on in corporate boardrooms. Shareholders are going to companies and saying, you need to disclose. That's a small but percolating movement, And I think you're seeing voluntarily a growing number of corporations realizing that they're getting a black eye, the corporate sector is getting a black eye, and they're voluntarily disclosing. So there's a lot of room for stuff to happen here that is outside of executive action, congressional action.
Yeah. I'd feel better if some of the disclosing groups were on the Republican side, too. They seem a little less subject to the disapprobation of the public on this.
But as we noted, the Kochs are already a little more sensitive to disclosure
Well,
than they used to
they're
be.
certainly running ads positioning themselves. The last thing I would say is on the Obama and the fundraising point, I wrote in my book that, you know, we are guilty of helping to promote the proliferation of spending, and we did it, went outside the system because we were worried about a swift boat Veterans for Truth kind of campaign against us, and we wanted to be equipped to deal with it. But we raised more small donations than ever, and if we had just relied on the small donations, we still would have been in some jeopardy. So it's a tough, thorny problem, you know, and threatening to, you know, our sense of who we are.
Mm-hmm. Julie, last word.
No, I think that's totally right. And just to go back to the motives of donors, it's a really tricky issue. Who knows why human beings do anything? The most that you can do as a reporter is look at business interests, look at the times that the donors have been in the public eye, what they're saying. There's a lot of reporting resources for that, just looking at their interactions with state legislatures and so forth. So don't give up, even though you normally don't have donors saying to you exactly why they're giving. It's still our job to try to piece it together as best we can.
All right. I want to thank our panelists for this. This was great.